One egg cracked open. The other 7 never did. That's not a metaphor. That's a real morning, somewhere in the Cretaceous, in a nest that should have held 8 hatchlings and instead held 1. No mother arrived to explain why. No siblings to learn from. Just one small animal, alone, in a world built entirely around groups. What happens to that hatchling next? It's a strange question to ask about an animal that's been dead for 80 million years. But it's a real one. And the answer says something bigger than you'd expect. Most people assume a lone hatchling simply dies. Fast. Quietly. Off-screen, in the version of prehistory we carry in our heads. It's an easy assumption. Nature documentaries train us to think that way. No parent, no group, no chance. But the fossil record tells a Messier story. Paleontologists have found juvenile dinosaur remains from several different species that show clear signs of survival well past hatching. Animals that grew, fed, and lived for months or years without any evidence of a surviving sibling group nearby. Not every lone hatchling died in its first week, which means somewhere out there, animals were doing something we rarely give them credit for. Surviving completely alone, from birth, in a world engineered for groups. Let's sit with that, because it raises an uncomfortable question. How does a species built for group life survive as an individual when the group simply isn't there? Here's where paleontology gets interesting. Many dinosaur species, especially smaller theropods, appear to have relied heavily on early independence. Their legs were long. Their bodies were light. Some species may have been capable of basic foraging within days of hatching. That's the key detail most people miss. A lone hatchling wasn't necessarily helpless. It may have been built, from birth, with more self-sufficiency than we assume. Which flips the emotional framing of this story. This isn't a tale of total helplessness. It's a tale of biological readiness meeting brutal circumstance. Let's go deeper into what that circumstance might have looked like. Picture a small theropod hatchling, alone in dense fern undergrowth. No calls answered when it chirps. No warmth beside it at night. Just instinct, and whatever internal wiring evolution gave it for exactly this scenario. It would have had to learn threat recognition immediately. No older sibling to copy. No parent to model caution. Every decision, freeze, flee, approach, made entirely from instinct and whatever limited experience it managed to survive long enough to gain. This is where the story becomes less about tragedy and more about resilience. Because survival like this isn't sentimental. It's mechanical, cold, and oddly impressive. Evolution doesn't require guarantees. It only requires that some fraction of individuals, even isolated ones, make it long enough to reproduce. Which means lone survival wasn't necessarily rare. It may have been a quietly overlooked part of dinosaur life all along. Here's the twist that changes the emotional shape of this entire story. We tend to assume isolation is always harmful. That's true for highly social animals, but not universally true across the animal kingdom. Some species are simply built to expect solitude as a normal part of early life. Certain modern reptiles offer a clue. Many turtle and crocodilian hatchlings receive zero parental care after birth. They're independent by necessity, not tragedy. Their nervous systems are calibrated for exactly that experience. If some dinosaur species shared even a partial version of that biology, then a lone hatchling wasn't necessarily suffering in the way we imagine. It may have simply been living the life its body was designed for. That reframes everything. This isn't about a creature failing to get what it needed. It's about a creature whose needs were different from what we assume. Still, not all dinosaurs were built this way. Some species clearly relied on extended parental care, nesting sites, repeated adult visits, evidence of feeding behavior. For those species, a lone hatchling losing its entire nest would have faced a much harder path. Which means the emotional weight of this story depends entirely on which kind of dinosaur we're imagining. Some hatchlings were built for solitude. Others were built for connection, and lost it instantly. This is where the deeper psychology kicks in. Because the real question isn't simply, could a hatchling survive alone? It's, what does survival cost an animal that isn't built for it? For social-dependent species, isolation likely triggered heightened stress responses, elevated alertness, increased caution, possibly disrupted feeding patterns. We see this today in social animals separated too early from their groups. Increased vigilance. Erratic behavior. A nervous system straining to compensate for missing social scaffolding. If certain dinosaur species had similar social dependency, a lone hatchling wasn't just physically vulnerable. It was operating with an incomplete behavioral toolkit, forced to improvise constantly in a world that assumed backup would always be nearby. Let's push this further, into something even stranger. Some fossil sites suggest juvenile dinosaurs occasionally joined mixed-age or even mixed-species groups temporarily, likely for safety in numbers. Not permanent bonds, just brief windows of shared vulnerability reduction. If a lone hatchling survived long enough, it may have eventually joined a loosely structured group, not out of social need in the human sense, but because proximity to others statistically improved survival odds. Safety without belonging. Company without connection. That's a strange kind of existence to imagine. Surrounded, but not truly part of anything. Present, but never fully integrated. Here's the twist that reframes the entire emotional arc of this story. We assume connection is always the goal. But for a solitary survivor, temporary proximity to others may have offered something different. Practical benefit without emotional cost. No group to lose. No bond to grieve. Just tactical advantage, taken when available, released when unnecessary. Which means this isn't purely a tragedy. It may have been an entirely different kind of survival strategy, one built on flexibility rather than belonging. Let's bring this back to the bigger question hiding underneath everything we've covered. What was it like being the only survivor of your nest? The honest answer is, it depended entirely on what kind of animal you were. For some species, solitude was manageable, even expected. For others, it may have meant operating with a permanent behavioral handicap, compensating constantly for support that should have existed but didn't. We don't know what any individual hatchling actually experienced internally. We can't interview a fossil. We can't know if isolation felt like anything at all to a creature with a walnut-sized brain and instinct-driven behavior. But the pattern the evidence reveals is honest and, in its own way, remarkable. Some animals are built for connection. Some are built for independence. And some are forced to discover moment by moment which one they actually needed, with no guidebook, no guarantee, and no second chance to get it wrong. So the next time you imagine a lone hatchling in a ruined nest, don't assume tragedy. Don't assume triumph either. Picture instead an animal running an experiment it never agreed to. Testing, in real time, whether its biology matched the world it was born into. And if survival sometimes depends less on strength, and more on whether your instincts happen to match the circumstances you're thrown into. What does that tell us about the difference between surviving and truly belonging?